In the Great Crusade, the 18 Legiones Astartes spearheaded the Imperium of Man's conquering of the stars. Led by their Primarchs, the Space Marines brought a large portion of the galaxy to compliance, though a full half of them would later turn traitor in the Horus Heresy. Of course, foot soldiers and ground vehicles alone would never be enough to win the Imperium's wars, and so the legions were kitted out with mighty fleets, some of which is still in use to a degree today. The greatest ships in these fleets were undoubtedly the flagships of the various Primarchs, and it is these vessels that we shall discuss today. Though we don't always know large amounts about them, they're undoubtedly worthy of discussion, and whilst we're here, we'll also discuss the other elements of the Legiones and Adeptus Astartes fleets. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. In the days of the Great Crusade, the fleets of the Legiones Astartes were mighty indeed, far stronger than even the combined arms of the Adeptus Astartes today. These fleets included a broad spectrum of ships, the classes of which we've covered in the Imperial Navy log in the past: light cruisers, battle cruisers, and battleships in ascending order of size and power. There's more to it, of course, but that's just a snapshot. The main difference between today's Imperial Navy and the old Astartes fleets was the prevalence of strike craft and landers. The Space Marines were, and still are, adept at planetary invasion, so ships capable of operating in the void and especially in atmosphere were incredibly useful. There is also a larger number of space-bound fighters, though why exactly I wouldn't be sure. I'm assuming it's suited to the lightning assault style of the Astartes to have large numbers of smaller agile ships as opposed to a small number of juggernauts in the void. Plus it may have helped with destroying space stations, etc. I'm not an expert. The battleships were the jewels in the crown for the Astartes, almost always forming the capital and flagships of their fleets. Even the Emperor used the battle barge, a class of battleships still in service today, holding about 3 companies of Astartes, as his own flagship in the early Crusade. The V Cephalus, a misspelling of the steed for a legendary Terran hero, was in service for the Battle of Gyros Thravian, where the Emperor and his custodians slew the Orc warlord Blackfang, who was on the verge of defeating Horus, Mortarion, and Rogel Dawn, and all their legions, all at once. Flipping heck. It was eventually retired in favour of the Imperator Somnium, a unique ship far, far larger that dwarfed pretty much everything in the standard Astartes fleets, but I don't know any engagements it actually fought in. Who knows, maybe it never did get used for war. However, in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, everything changed. Robert Guilliman was in the process of penning the Codex Astartes, and all within the Imperium agreed that the power of the various forces needed to be divided to prevent another civil war like the Heresy, where the rebelling army would have access to everything. This led to the division of the Imperial Navy from the Astra Militarum, and of course, the splitting of the Legiones Astartes into chapters, but it had major ramifications for the fleets of the Space Marines as well. Said fleets had been a major sticking point for people. Some wanted the fleets taken off the Astartes aside from transport ships within their home systems, in a similar manner to the Guard and the Navy. Others, notably Corvus Corax, argued that the Marines needed, more ships, pointing to the destruction wrought in Istvan V and the inability of the Loyalists to escape from the trap. For once, the Imperials actually made a compromise, maybe even a logical one, managing probably to appease both parties to some extent. The Astartes fleets were reduced, yes, and there was a greater focus on transport, yes, but they weren't disarmed, and they stayed under Astartes control. The primary role of the fleet was to allow and facilitate planetary invasion rather than being dedicated space fighters. The only gunships were the strike craft, meaning that if the Space Marines went rogue, they'd be completely outgunned by the new Imperial Navy. This in turn meant that the primary function of the Angels of Death was unchanged, allowing them to continue their work, but they'd not be toothless in space and would not be at the whims of another external force to move around like the Imperial Guard now were with the Navy. The side effect of the change was a reduction in a variety of vessels in the Astartes fleets. Whether this is due to the changes made by Guilliman and co, or simply that a bunch of old designs just fell out of use because they couldn't be fixed, I'm not sure. But I must note, a bunch of them are now part of Imperial Navy battle fleets, at least as reserves or in parts. So it's possible that some of those gunship type vessels, the ones with really big guns that the Navy didn't want the Marines to have, were transferred to the Navy's control, or maybe something like that. Honestly, it's a little bit vague about the details of this event, so can't be sure. Perhaps in an echo of the different approaches of the Legiones Astartes, Space Marine fleets have a very diverse composition from chapter to chapter. Given that some chapters are entirely fleet-based, this perhaps is no surprise. Between the Crusade-era vessels now seemingly largely retired and the plethora of assault craft available, One would think in turn that a chapter's fleet would be just as diverse in terms of type of ship, but even the old school fleets didn't have a hugely broad range of vessels, well, gunships aside. The main escort vessel for the Astartes is the Gladius Frigate, a variant of the Navy's Sword-class frigate with about 20% more engine power and enough firepower to match many of the cruisers in the Navy as well. This makes it incredibly dangerous, combining the firepower of a cruiser and more speed than many escorts, though it is no more durable than any of the other vessels in its class. Though, as a similar vessel to the Sword, it is still surprisingly durable, for an escort. The more interesting escort vessel is the Nova Frigate, one of the only capital ship hunters left in the Astartes fleet and thus incredibly controversial as a result. It's very rare, due to both the Navy and even the Inquisition taking issue with its defiance of the Astartes Codex, etc., and it is incapable of transport, but its frankly ludicrous speed and arms allow it to get in prime firing position and deliver a killing blow. Interestingly, the crew of a frigate is almost entirely not Space Marines. Only a single squad will probably be on board a Gladius frigate, usually at command post. The rest of the crew will be chapter serfs, indentured in service to the chapter, and as well trained as Imperial guardsmen. The reason for this is actually quite simple when you think about it. Why waste the incredibly valuable resource of a Space Marine on manning a spaceship's turret, when you can just have a regular human do it? Makes sense. Working our way up to the cruiser class, nowadays you pretty much only see one type of cruiser in the Astartes fleets, the strike cruiser. This ship can hold a fully equipped company of Space Marines and is able to deploy this payload of power-armored death in as little as 20 minutes from entering orbit. Such is the reputation of the strike cruiser, its arrival over a planet can be enough to quell a rebellion even before the Space Marines need to make planetfall. It's primarily kitted out for invasion, as you might expect. Unlike the similar Dauntless light cruiser in the Navy, it carries a mighty bombardment cannon with the fortress and environment-destroying magma bombs, and it carries a gunship bay to provide an alternate deployment to drop pod assault. Said gunships are usually the Thunderhawk gunship, first deployed in the late Great Crusade to replace the Stormbirds of the Legiones Astartes, even though ironically there were many who didn't like it at first and thought it would just be dropped or replaced before long. How wrong they were. The largest, with only a handful of exceptions, of Space Marine vessels, and certainly the largest one common across almost all chapters, is undoubtedly the Battle Barge. This battleship is capable of carrying up to 3 companies of Astartes, and usually a chapter will have 2 or 3 of them. The rest of the chapter will obviously get around in strike cruisers, since there likely isn't room otherwise. They're among the strongest vessels in the Imperial fleet, both because of their crew/payload and because of their arms. Like the strike cruiser, the battle barge is armed with a bombardment cannon that keeps firing even as the Space Marines go planet-side, as well as an array of macro cannons, etc. for ship-to-ship combat. It's capable of taking on and destroying most warships, but it excels especially at boarding actions, overwhelming shields and allowing the comparatively vast Astartes forces to scuttle the ship. A perhaps lesser-known weapon for the battle barge is the most dangerous of its armaments, cyclonic torpedoes and virus bombs. Yep, the battle barges are more than capable of enacting exterminatus. Chapter masters are the only Astartes capable of giving the order, but the weapons are there, just as they always have been. In the Betrayal List Van 3, Gary's discovery of virus bombs on his frigate was surprising because he believed only capital ships had them, and guess what? Battle barges have always been on the level of capital ships for the Astartes. The largest and most powerful of the battle barges was probably the Gloriana-class battleship, classed as capital battle barges. In fact, it's said that they were the largest Imperial warships of all, save a couple of unique exceptions. Though almost all of these vessels belonged to the Astartes, it was not exclusively their design. The Amphion, a Gloriana in the Imperialis Armada, was deployed against the traitorous forward of Zana before Dark Angels, Black Shields, and Shattered Legionaries were able to land and then capture Ordinatus weapons destined for Horus's forces. Interestingly, the Gloriana still sees a measure of service today amongst both traitor and loyalist forces. Aside from the legendary ships we'll discuss soon, none are known to exist in the modern age, however, so I do suspect that none have been built in recent times, whether that's because of lack of resources, lost STC, better design, can't really say. It's the Imperium. Alright, now for the bit you've all been waiting for. Let's take a look at the flagships of the Primarchs. For the record, it may help you get a little more context if you've seen the various Legions logs, as I'll be discussing events here that I fleshed out more there. It isn't necessary, but it may be useful to watch them first. Because, well, reasons, let's just go by ascending legion number and start with Lionel, Johnston and the Dark Angels. Lion's flagship was the Invincible Reason, a Gloriana-class ship. Actually, just assume I'm discussing a Gloriana unless I say otherwise. At this moment, we know very little about the ship besides its name and class, but we can assume it was extremely large. Not the largest though, even amongst the flagships. We'll get to those. We assume this because Conrad Kersey was able to hide in the bowels of the ship for the entire trip between the close of the Thramas Crusade and the arrival of the Dark Angels on Macragge. Besides the battles over Diamat and the Thramas Crusade itself, we actually don't know what became of the Invincible Reason. I assume it was at the fall of Caliban, but as it hasn't appeared since, I cannot be sure if it was or if it survived. The Emperor's children actually seem to have two flagships, the second being the Andronicus belonging to Lord Commander Eidolon, though Fulgrim's personal vessel was the Pride of the Emperor. Built over Jupiter with its construction overseen by the fabricated general of Mars himself, this vessel contained council chambers known as the Heliopolis, capable of seating 2,000 people, and where Fulgrim gave his speeches and held pre-battle feasts. It became hideously mutated as time passed, and by the time of the Battle of Thessala in the Great Scouring, it was a grotesque shadow of its former self. This was the battle that saw Robert Guilliman almost killed by Fulgrim within the Heliopolis itself, but the Pride was crippled in the engagement, and so its current status is unknown. As for the Iron Warriors and Perturabo, we have the Iron Blood, one of the largest of the Primarch flagships of all. Some say it was actually the largest of all Gloriana battleships, but I can't back that one up. Unlike the Pride of the Emperor, built over Jupiter perhaps before the 3rd Legion even reached Chamos, the Iron Blood was built over Perturabo's adopted home of Olympia. It actually had no viewports, as Perturabo didn't see the point of them when he had Auspex scans, etc., but it was said to be capable of wiping entire fleets on its own. It was famously boarded during the Battle of Fal by a contingent of Imperial fists, with one managing to reach the bridge and Perturabo himself, but since the end of the heresy, the Iron Blood has not been seen again, at least to my knowledge. The White Scars and Jagtai Khan definitely had two flagships, with the original being destroyed relatively late in the heresy. This ship was the Swordstorm, and it may surprise no one to learn it was the fastest ship in its class after extensive modification. Involved in the breakout from Chondax against the Alpha Legion and then again in the Second Battle of Prospero, the Swordstorm was lost in the Battle of the Catalyst Rift against the Death Guard. Jagtai abandoned the vessel and allowed Mortarion to board it, before the Magyar Mazan reactivated the Void Shields to trap him aboard and destroy both him and them when the massive ship exploded. Following this and the White Scar's flight to Terra, Jagtai took the Dictatus-class battleship Lance of Heaven as the Legion's new flagship, but sadly we have no known incidents involving it. Who knows, maybe it actually went missing alongside the Khan. As for the Space Wolves, Leman Russ's flagship was, and excuse my probably terrible pronunciation, the Hrafnical. Named after a king of Fenrisian myth who looked to his sons for strength in battle, cough cough symbolism much, this was alongside the Iron Blood as one of the largest Gloriana-class ships. It was of course present in the burning of Prospero and the Battle of the Alaxes Nebula, along with one assumes all of Russ's battles in the Crusade, but it has also not been seen in the modern era. This one I can explain, however. Russ and all his Wolfguard did leave the Space Wolves and enter the Eye of Terror post-heresy, so I assume they just took the Hrafnical with them. Can't back that up though. Though there was a Gloriana-class ship in the Imperial Fist, the Eternal Crusader that became the Fortress Monastery of the Black Templars post-heresy, Rogaldorn's flagship was, well, possibly not even classed as a ship. This was the Phalanx, a star fortress from the Dark Age of technology found and rebuilt by Dawn over his homeworld of Inwit. The Primarch was aboard it when the Imperium arrived, and he offered it to the Emperor as a gift, but it was returned to Dawn and served as the heart of the Imperial Fist fleet, probably the most powerful in all of the Legiones Astartes. It didn't see as much action as the other flagships in the heresy, since Dawn was back at Terra throughout it, but it did transport him to Pluto's moon of Hydra to allow him to, probably, slay Alpharius in the Solar War. It fell into a level of disrepair after the separation of the Imperial Fists into chapters, as it was simply too large for a single chapter to maintain and too complex to be repaired. So in the War of the Beast it was kept away from the battles with the Orcish attack moons and their battleship-killing gravitic whips. The Phalanx still serves as the Imperial Fist Fortress Monastery to this day, and was actually invaded in late M41 by a force of Iron Warriors and a Demon Prince Be'lakor, who planned to turn the fortress on Terra. Forced to turn the phalanx guns on itself to combat a virus, the Imperial Fist 3rd Company were ultimately victorious thanks in no small part to the arrival of the Legion of the Damned, who helped defeat Bellicor and allow the phalanx to move to assist at Cadia. It there destroyed one of Abaddon the Despoiler's Blackstone fortresses before leading the evacuation of the Imperials from the Cadia system. Conrad Kersey's flagship was the Nightfall, containing strung-up bodies in the Primarchs' quarters, and which was extensively modified by Perturabo to contain labyrinths and traps. It may be that this was where Vulcan was held after the drop site massacre, since the final gauntlet in that incident was a labyrinth of Perturabo's design, but I have no empirical evidence. Following Kersey's entrapment aboard the Invincible Reason, command of the Nightfall passed to a captain called Thandamel, allied to Kersey's equerry Shang. This command didn't last long, however. Captain Gendor Scrivok killed Shang and took command of the Nightfall from Thandamel, stating his plan to join the Night Lords with Horus and push on Terra, though whether he and the ship were there, I cannot guarantee. As Scrivok is now a demon prince known as the Painted Count, his title within the Legion due to his Nostraman ancestry and war paint, it is unknown what use the Nightfall has today, especially with Kers being almost certainly dead. Finally, for this first half of the Legions, we have Sanguinius' flagship, the golden battleship known as the Red Terre. Said to be one of the most beautiful vessels, it saw action throughout the Crusade, including on the world of murder against the Megarachnids, but it was one of very few Primarch flagships known to be destroyed in the Horus Heresy. Its commanding officer became maddened by the chaos presence on Cygnus Prime, destroying the controls and forcing the Red Terre to crash on the planet below. Most of the crew were lost, but the ship was salvaged to an extent, made into a fortress by Sanguinius during the battle on Cygnus Prime, and was then towed back to Baal to remove all trace of the 9th Legion from the world. Sanguinius took the Covenant of Baal as his new flagship, but its class, history, and known engagements are sadly unknown. Actually, we didn't get to the end of the first half. Now we do. Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands, their flagship was known as the Fist of Iron, an appropriate one to be sure. It served as the meeting place for Manus and Fulgrim before the heresy, which would lead to a fight between the two Primarchs who had been the closest of friends as Fulgrim tried to turn Manus on the Emperor. The pride of the Emperor then crippled the Fist of Iron in the skirmish that followed, and so the flagship was out of commission for the drop site massacre on Istvan V. The strike cruiser Ferrum became a temporary flagship of the Iron Hands for that engagement, but the fate of both it and the Fist of Iron is sadly unknown. Angron's flagship the Conqueror was in service even before the World Eater Primarch was found on New Seria, though it was known initially as the Adamant Resolve. It was one of the larger Gloriana ships alongside the Ironblood and Harafnical, I should really stop trying to say that, and it was modified to include in effect a giant harpoon array, allowing the World Eaters to launch boarding actions on a skewered enemy ship. Commanded at the time by Lotara Sarin, a human woman who was well respected by the Astartes and was even on good terms with Angron, the Conqueror has changed hands many times over the past 10 millennia, like many World Eater relics, including Gorefather, Angron's primary chain axe pre-ascension to demonhood. It was actually thought destroyed in M35, but it survived, and it was present in both the Gothic War and the 13th Black Crusade. As for the Ultramarines, well, I have questions. The Macragge's Honour was, and still is, the flagship of Robert Guilliman, most famously present for the Battle of Calth when the Wordbearers ambushed the 13th Legion. It was invaded by demons, but the efforts of Guilliman, Enid Thiel and Marius Gage saw the ship hold, and they were able to push back the demonic invaders. Guilliman then tasked Gage and the Honour with hunting down Corferin as the traitors fled, leading to a battle in the warp between it and Ferrin's flagship, the Infidus Imperator. Though Gage was successful, at least in part since Corferin survived but the ship didn't, the Macragge's Honour was becalmed in the warp and repairs were immediately started. One assumes they succeeded, since in M41 the Ultramarines still magically possessed the Macragge's Honour. No mention of when it got back, how it got back, what it did over the last 10 millennia, whether Marius Gage was still on board and what happened to him afterwards, but there you go. It became Guilliman's flagship once again following his return, though in the Terran Crusade it was captured by Huron Blackheart and the Red Corsairs allied to Kairos Fateweaver. Go Ultramarines. They then somehow seemingly got it back again afterwards, refitted and serving as Guilliman's flagship once more in the Indomitus Crusade. Don't ask, still got no idea. Speaking of returned Primarchs, Mortarian's flagship also remains in active service. The Endurance is not believed to have been anything special in terms of unique modifications, but being a Gloriana-class vessel, it was still probably impressive, and will have absolutely carried virus bombs given the Death Guard's usual methods of waging war. Either following the transformation of the Death Guard into the Plague Marines, or after the heresy in general, the Endurance became infested with Nurgle's power, even becoming host to a portion of the Garden of Nurgle itself. Though it may not have been used by Mortarion for the longest time, since the Death Lord was pretty inactive for several millennia, it has been taken back by the Primarch as part of his invasion of Ultramar. Interestingly, it said Mortarion often used a backup flagship, the battle barge Reaper's Scythe. It's said to be where many of the rituals of the Death Guard took place, and it's actually still in use today, under the command of Chaos Lord Imperialis the Virulent. Concluding the triumvirate of returned Primarchs, convenient for our purposes how they're all in ascending legion number, we have Magnus the Red. Magnus's flagship was the Photep, sharing a name with the pyramid at the heart of Prospero's capital Tizca, and like that pyramid, it was Magnus's sanctum and place of meditation, to the point that he had replicas of said sanctum built whenever he went planetside. It served as a repository for information, including a library for Arzik Ahriman, who I guess even as first captain didn't have his own ship? The Photep was sent away in command of around 1/3 of the Thousand Suns fleet in the build-up to the burning of Prospero, but it was able to find its way to the planet of the Sorcerers not long after the Legionaries arrived, much to everyone's surprise, including Magnus's. I suspect he's in shenanigans, if I'm being honest. It's not been seen since, which perhaps is unsurprising given how capable the Thousand Suns are at invading planets even without a fleet, but I suspect that Magnus has kept the Photep around for some irrational reason, maybe nostalgia or something. Probably the most famous, or, well, infamous, of the Primarch's flagships is almost certainly that of Horus Lupercal, the Vengeful Spirit, part of the contingent of the largest Gloriana ships, perhaps actually too big, as the centre of the ship was rotting, filled with rats. I suspect it was likely amongst the first of its kind to be built, as it was built in M30 by Martian hands, and as the personal vessel of none other than the War Master, I would not be surprised if it had rather impressive origins even beyond the others in its class. It is said that the arrival of the Vengeful Spirit was enough to become or force the surrender of an entire system, and honestly, I can believe it. The ship was the site of a failed attempt by the Knights Errant to assassinate Horus on Malek in the Heresy, and of course its bridge served as the setting for the final duel between the empowered Horus and the Emperor during the Battle of Terra. It now lies in the hands of Horus's successor as War Master, Abaddon the Despoiler, who took the ship with him when he abandoned the Sons of Horus post-Heresy. It continues to serve as, in effect, the flagship of all Traitor Astartes to this day, seeing battle most recently in the 13th Black Crusade. For the word-bearers and Lorgar Aurelian, there was the Fidelitas Lex, the High Gothic term meaning law of faith. Strangely, we know very little about the vessel, not even Lorgar's quarters, but I don't doubt it contained at least one massive shrine to the Emperor. It was actually destroyed in the Shadow Crusade, believed to be during the battles over New Seria, but potentially over Armatura instead, and it's also unknown which ship Lorgar would take as a flagship following the death of the Fidelitas Lex. Since he's not been around post-heresy, just in his temple on Sakaris, we haven't really got any way to check. As for Vulcan and the Salamanders, we sadly know very little about his flagship, the Flame Wrought, not to be confused with the modern battle barge sharing its name. Seriously, all we know about this thing is its name, and the fact that it was present at the drop site massacre. It wasn't confirmed as destroyed, but it hasn't shown up since, so we can't be sure it survived either. I suspect it had a forge aboard given the way the Salamanders in Vulcan operated, but beyond that, I can only speculate, and sadly it doesn't seem as if Vulcan ever took a flagship again before his most recent disappearance/death in the War of the Beast. There's much less speculation to be done regarding the flagship of Corvus Corax and the Raven Guard, the Shadow of the Emperor. Though its Crusade-era history, perhaps fittingly for the 19th Legion, is unknown, it did not survive the Horus Heresy. It was destroyed during the drop site massacre by the Terminus Est, flagship of Callus Typhon of the Death Guard. Unfortunately, we don't know if Corax took a new flagship in his short time with his sons following Estevan V, especially since the ship he presumably took when he disappeared is also unknown. The Raven Guard did name another ship after the Shadow of the Emperor, however, a strike cruiser called the Second Shadow that served their 5th company, but it was also destroyed by the Terminus Est. Guess Typhus really doesn't want there to be a ship under that name or even a subsidiary of it. And finally, we have the Alpha Legion. And honestly, I'm a little bit annoyed. As befits a legion that had 2 Primarchs, the Alpha Legion had 2 flagships, the Alpha and the Beta. I see what you did there, but come on, why wasn't it Alpha and Omega? Never mind. The two would alternate as the main flagship of Alpharius. I just assume Omegon took the other one, and it's believed that the Beta was the senior of the two when the twin Primarchs met with the Cabal prior to their betrayal. Command passed back over to the Alpha in time for the Battle of the Alaxes Nebula against the Space Wolves and the Heresy, and after that, it was the Alpha that led the infiltration of the Sol system with the mind-swapped Alpharius. It then led the Alpha Legion fleet during the Battle of Pluto, but following that, it was seemingly the Beta that was Omegon's ship of choice. We don't know what became of either of these twin ships, especially after the supposed fall of Omegon in the Great Scouring, but I somehow don't doubt they're out there, somewhere. And no, I'm still not over them not calling them Alpha and Omega. I mean, come on. So there you have it, a brief look at the fleets of the Adeptus Astartes, as well as much of what we know on the various flagships of the Primarchs. A part of me is disappointed that we don't know more about these legendary ships, especially ones such as the Fidelitas Lex, Flamewrought or Photep, but we know a little, and that will have to be enough. As concerns the fleet in general, what it lacks in diversity, it more than makes up for in both power in space and the payload it can send planet-side. The Space Marines are renowned warriors, and the ships that bring them to bear are just as renowned for good reason. Now, I think we've had a heck of a lot of Imperial stuff in recent time, so let's give humanity a break from our scrutiny for a second and look at something else. Actually, I feel like I should probably go back into the warp at some point. We've looked at the Immaterium, Chaos Gods, Demon Princes, Demon Engines, but I think looking at the most infamous true demonic servants of the Dark Gods, that would complete the set. Whilst we're at it, why not look in full depth at demons in general? We've touched on how they work in the past, but this would be a good chance to close the book on all things chaos. And now though, it is time to end. Thank you all for watching, my name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.